Hi, and welcome to She Said, She Said. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. If you are joining us for the first time, She Said, She Said is a conversation with, about, and for women where I talk to a very diverse and broad range of women from all different sectors and career fields and perspectives. They share their knowledge, their expertise, what they've learned, how they've recovered from failure, and so much more in an effort to really pay it forward. Whatever your goals or aspirations may be, we're not all the same. We don't all have the same goals, nor should we. These women recognize that, and they're sharing what they've learned in a manner that hopefully will help you as well. Today's guest is no exception. She is Marisa Porges. Marisa is the head of the Baldwin School, which is a school for girls. It's a 130-year-old school just outside of Philadelphia. She has a very interesting career that has culminated with this headmaster role that she currently holds. But she actually was a naval fighter pilot, one of only 8 women out of a battalion of 200. She worked in the White House, largely on counterterrorism policy. She traveled extensively in the Middle East, interviewing tribal leaders and Taliban members, among others. She has a fascinating story. And her story really resonates with me because it embodies this notion of a tri-sector athlete. A number of years ago, the former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, Joseph Nye, actually coined this term called tri-sector athlete. And it's used to describe people who have worked in different sectors and they bring those experiences and perspectives to bear on problem solving. And it really is a new way of thinking about how we solve some of the world's biggest problems. Well, Marisa embodies this notion, and she also talks about this and describes these skill sets in this fabulous new book that she's written. The book is out today, Tuesday, August the 4th. It's entitled What Girls Need to Know: How to Raise Bold, Courageous, Resilient Women. And I'll tell you something, as the mother of both a son and a daughter, while clearly these lessons apply largely to women, she's written the book with the focus of girls in mind, but they apply for boys too, and really everybody. So there's great advice and perspective in her book. I urge you to add it to your summer reading list. But first, I hope you'll stick around for my conversation with Marisa. Marisa, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I'm so happy to have you, and I'm so excited to talk about this amazing book. We have a lot of topics that we can dig into today, but why don't we start with the book? As I said in the intro, it actually hits newsstands and Amazon today, Tuesday, August 4th. Why this book, and where did the original inspiration for this book come from?
On one hand, it's a personal passion project, and like I think your work has proven to be as well, this idea of how we further empower women at all stages of life and really use our own stories of both success and failure to figure out what we can all do to play to our strengths and to really position the next generation of young women to succeed. So that's the big picture, and that's sort of what had always been in the back of my mind. But I have to say the inspiration for the book in particular, and the chapters and the stories that I include in there, came from the girls at my school. As Laura, you mentioned during the introduction, I now lead an all-girls school. And throughout the day, I see the girls in action from pre-K through 12, thinking about themselves in relation to each other in the real world, but then in particular, as they grow older, starting to struggle with themselves and their relation to the wider community and what the world looks like and what it will be, not just in college, but when they get out in the real world in their minds, right? When they're old, like us now, unfortunately, I guess, right? And the ideas for this book came in particular from a leadership seminar that I was teaching to Baldwin seniors. Mm-hmm. And the conversations really started turning to their idea for what it's going to be like when they, get out there and want to lead and do things, and what does that mean? And I started telling more and more stories from my own experience in the Navy and in the White House, working overseas, and then pulling in research that I know that both of us have seen play out over the years in person too, about how women can play to their strengths and really build their natural abilities to be competitive advantages. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden it came together. And then before you know it, here we are, and it's really fun to see come together. And of course, I think now more than ever, with where the world is spinning around us, I feel like a lot of the lessons in the book are really critical, not just for the next generation of young women, but for all of us who are working in new ways.
So you alluded to your personal story, and I talked just very briefly about it in the intro, but it's a fascinating, I mean, you have a fascinating background given where you are now. This is fairly unusual for the head of a girls' school to have served not only in the Navy, but as a fighter pilot in the Navy, to have worked in the White House, to have worked on counterterrorism, to have interviewed tribal leaders and Taliban members in the Middle East. I mean, talk about how your experiences inform your leadership and how you think about both the content of the book and what you're presenting as it relates to helping girls at the Baldwin School.
Yeah, I had the good fortune of following some of my childhood dreams, flying off an aircraft carrier, serving in the White House, traveling the world for work and research, and meeting really amazing, interesting people who challenged my thinking along the way as well.
Okay, now, can we just stop for just a second? Your childhood dream was to be a fighter pilot?
It was, yes. Here's
not
the
typical.
No, I was that kid.
Awesome, but not typical.
I was that kid. But it's a really interesting story, because when I was a kid, I wanted to fly off aircraft carriers. I'll actually attribute it to, for those of us at a certain generation who saw Top Gun when they were a child, and that was at least a little bit of how they thought would be an exciting career later. But I had the good fortune of going to the school I now lead. I went to Baldwin. I went to an all-girls school for middle school and high school. And when I was there, even though at the time, and I didn't even realize this, women weren't allowed to fly jets in combat. It was before the regulations had changed in the military on that front. And I didn't even realize that, but my teachers and the community around me was like, of course, Marisa one day is going to fly for an aircraft carrier, even though you can't tell on Zoom, but there's actually height restrictions that I barely meet, and all these other sort of hurdles I had to overcome, not least of which, of course, is still now there's only a handful of women who fly. When I was on my aircraft carrier, there was 8 of us who flew out of an air wing of approximately 200, and that, women fly, aviators, that is. And so all these hurdles were never part of my narrative, right? It was never something that was going to be a roadblock. And I think that's part of what we need to make sure young women today, realize and think about, whether it's they want to pursue a field in engineering or computer science or business or whatever other industry. Interestingly, even school administrators are by and large men. You think of it as a profession that has so many women in it, but at senior levels, the majority of heads of school are men still. And so wherever we look, I think we really need to think about how we position our young women, but that's how my story got started. And so I was sent out with this idea of, sure, go pursue your adventure. And I was taught lessons when I was young that helped on that. There was also things that I missed. And so part of this book is hopefully teaching our girls to really lean into those strengths and figure out whether it's how they think about empathetic communicating or adaptability or problem solving. But yeah, my own story has, ventured into the funny stories that you don't tell your mom when you come home until later. So there is that. But it's been, again, those moments of flying off the end of an aircraft carrier, very much inform my life now, not just because of the adventure aspect, but because of how it informs my risk taking and how it informs my leadership and what I really think is about, service leadership in terms of how we serve our communities, things like that.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, many, many interesting things that I found about your story and the way that you were able to weave it together with this content in the book, you talk about the fact that you suffered from air sickness as a pilot, which I find remarkable. Talk a little bit about that, because that was sort of a pivoting moment for you as well.
Yeah, it's a story. This is actually the first time I really publicly told the story in some way. It's a story that for a long time represented one of those moments of personal and professional failure, and something that it took a while to grapple with, this idea that when I was a kid, this was going to be my dream. I committed myself to this career, to serving in the military in this way, to serving my country in this way. And then once I got out there and was flying, I was actually a navigator. So I was, again, back to the Top Gun reference, I was goose to maverick. I was the backseat of the jet, but it did mean that you're sort of in the ejection seat flying combat maneuvers and all the rest. And I realized that physiologically, I wasn't well suited to the job. And I struggled throughout my time in training and then on deployment with serious air sickness, to the point where it unfortunately, it became a moment that, and you read about it. I tell the story of this reckoning where I, fortunately had a mentor who said to me, there's other things you can do to serve. But it was the first time that I'd faced this realization that I had to try something else, which it sounds funny to say in that way now. But it was, and some people would say, oh, of course, just do something else. But at the time it was what I considered a significant failure. And I think our girls in particular need to understand how to be resilient in those moments and how to adapt their thinking about themselves personally and professionally. Perfectionism is something that a lot of young women in particular struggle with. And we see that at schools in general, but our girls' schools is part of our narrative of how to be risk takers, how to practice failure and get good at it, how to then bounce back, and whether it's on the sports field or in a computer science or engineering lab. And this was that moment for me. And it was really a moment where I had to say, okay, I am getting literally airsick. I used to, it sounds, I used to hide from my superiors, from my commanding officer, the fact that I would get headaches and air sickness and just would struggle through certain flights because there was such significant air combat maneuvers when you're pulling G forces and evading, frankly, invading the enemy, that you're in training missions and things like that. I'm fortunate to later, there's actually a story that wasn't part of the book. It'll be part of, I guess, my next book or these podcast moments. But I was able to return to the carrier that I served on a few years later, after I'd come back from the Middle East doing research on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And my air wing, a couple of years later, was redeployed in the Persian Gulf. And they flew me out, the admiral in charge of the air wing flew me out to brief the senior leaders on what was happening on the ground. I had just returned from Yemen and Afghanistan, and I came back and literally revisited this old, not just the old community but the old aviators I flew with, the pilot that I flew missions with, the folks I served with. And it was a good moment to realize that, when one door closes, another opens, and I was still able to serve this community that I'd really been so committed to, but just in a different way. And I spent a couple of days with them out in the Persian Gulf, briefing everyone on what was going on the ground so that they could conduct their missions from the air with that perspective in mind of what was happening in Afghanistan at the time. But yeah, it was a funny thing to land back on the carrier and see my pilot and my fellow aviators again, and just, go back to call signs and all the rest as you were enjoying
That's amazing. So as you think back to this experience, it was very painful for you at the time for obvious reasons, but as you reflect on it now and you think about it from the standpoint of helping other girls think about bouncing back from failure or setback, talk from a practical standpoint about kind of what the toolkit was that you dug into. What was it that helped you pivot through that? Because, I think it's fair to say you could really have a major setback and it'd be incredibly difficult to make that pivot. So how did you?
So I think there's a couple key, muscles that we want to start building in ourselves and in our girls, so that when these moments happen, because they're inevitable at all points in life, this idea that not just resilience in moments of difficulty, but adapting to change. Change is everywhere, particularly right now. And we need to really help our kids practice this, and help our girls in particular practice, so that they can do a few things. One is to develop a really flexible mindset, a flexible thinking mindset, so that they realize that these moments of change and adaptability can be their strength. And that can look like anything. I mean, I think right now we think of it in particular in regards to how we're relating to our girls in school, but even as adults, how we're relating as mothers and women at home, working at home. Sure. But we can practice this in small ways, right? It's thinking about, this is a small example maybe, but when you get your child's assignment to what class she's in for the coming year, I think there's inevitably this moment of, oh, she's not with her best friend, let's ask to change sections, change classes. And the thought is, well, or her favorite teacher, the one she has had previously and is familiar with. Well, there's actually a moment to say, wait a minute, this is a good moment in a very safe, supportive environment to say, no, let's have her stretch herself and practicing, engaging different people. We know that she'll be safe. It's in school, maybe a summer camp, maybe instead of choosing that after school activity that all her friends are doing, you say, no, let's try something different. Let's do it different with a different group, so that you practice this idea of navigating differences, navigating tension points. I think we can do it ourselves when we think about how we lean into new work projects and really own those little moments as moments to practice this idea of adapting to the bigger pivots in life that come with, changing jobs, changing work, moving, recognizing that a career path isn't for you and you need to adjust. I think the other thing, and this is a really interesting one that is borne out in the research, is thinking about how we use lessons of failure, not just lessons of success, to reinforce what it takes to bounce back and adapt. We always think that it has to be a positive lesson moment, or at least I do, right? You have to be like, oh, don't worry, when I did X, it turned out Y. When I went to that overnight camp for the first time, or when it was my first time running for, student leader, I got it. So you just, lean into it, do it too, because it helps. It makes us feel better, frankly, I'm sure. And it sounds good as an anecdote, right? Research actually shows that lessons of failure stick more when you're teaching adaptability. They've done these studies with first responders and military officers and others who have to deal with crisis moments. And it's actually the lessons that say, the first time I did it, it didn't work, and this is why. Those are the ones you say, oh. And then you either adjust what you're doing, or you think, well, maybe it's okay if it doesn't work out for me, but I'm still going to try it. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that, particularly for our young women, to hear from their moms, their aunts, their teachers, the adults in their lives about these moments that didn't work out quite so well, are really important to help them take more risk and get better at bouncing back, because they'll both learn from our lessons and realize that these moments aren't failure with a big F. They're just little, blips along the way.
Sure, absolutely. So, there's so much in this book that they're both lessons for young women, but they're also lessons for parents. And, there's a lot of discussion about this notion of what's called helicoptering, right? Where you maybe hover a little much over your children, which is an easy pattern to fall into. You don't want to see them hurt. You don't want to see them disappointed. Talk about why this notion of helicoptering maybe is doing more harm than good, and kind of what you see from parents who are perhaps struggling with this. Yeah. And it's true for girls and boys too, I should say.
Yeah, it's true across both genders. It is definitely, we want to protect our kids. We want to see them grow and protect them from those moments where we can, where we think that's the right option to take. It's an interesting quandary, because over time, it unfortunately reinforces the ideas that they can't do it themselves, right? But also more than that, even just not this notional idea of what should be theirs to own. It doesn't let them practice, right? This idea that we all have to practice these little ways of being that they'll need when they're adults, right? A great example is how we get our girls in particular to practice using their voice, speaking up, advocating for themselves. It's super easy for a parent to step in a moment and be like, oh, well, I'll talk with the school. I'll talk with your coach. I'll talk with, whoever offered the first job and explain why the time won't work, or the salary's not right, or maybe, she didn't get the best opportunity on a test because insert here some reason, which could be a perfectly valid one. It's not that. But these are such perfect moments when girls in particular, when children are young, to help them practice the act of self-advocating. You can start when a child is in elementary school, and have her order for not just herself, but the whole family when you're at a restaurant, right? Or have her be the one who goes and speaks up at an amusement park or a hotel or wherever you're out and about, to ask for directions, to give feedback, to, give comments. And, in the process of doing that, you're not just reinforcing with your daughter that you value her voice and that you think she's capable of doing it, even from a young age, but you're helping her practice and getting over a little bit of the insecurity or the fear or awkwardness. Maybe it's introversion. This isn't about making her an extrovert, but nonetheless, introverts need to be able to use their voices too in work environments and other places, so that later when she's an adult and it's that moment to talk with a teacher or speak up to a boss. For me, it was that moment when I was at a table in the West Wing with the President of the United States, right? In this weird moment when all of a sudden I realized I had lost my voice, right? Cat got my tongue, such a cliche. Here I was, a career, defining moment. And I was, not speaking up as much as I should have or wish I'd had. But I do think it's practice, 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 and reinforcing the value that we as adults place on young girls' voices so that they get that chance from early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, such incredibly good advice. I'd love for you to talk a bit about this. You include in the book, there's an entire chapter on adaptability, which I thought was so interesting because there's some new research that you talk about the value of that. And you referenced COVID a moment ago and how we're all having to be really dig deep and find ways to adapt and pivot. Maybe talk about what you found in the context of researching this book and what your own personal experience has been. Maybe share some of that as well, because I thought it was fascinating. And I think too, like the tie for so many of the conversations that we have on this podcast about career and personal evolution. Mm-hmm. And as I read the chapter, it immediately like sent bells off in my head thinking, God, why don't we do more talking about this notion of being agile much earlier? It makes these career pivots much easier. Anyway, but I don't want to step on your points, but I was just so moved by the chapter. I thought it was fantastic.
Well, thank you. And you're exactly right. I mean, we can look at both our careers and think about all these moves along the way that fundamentally altered our personal and professional lives. And, it's good. And, whether by training or luck that we were able to lean into a natural adaptability, because it's not something that we really train in ourselves unless we think about it. And that's just a really recent phenomenon, thinking about it in that way. And that's what the research shows. There's actually a new idea. We always, I'll take a step back. We always think about IQ, intellectual quotient. And recently in the past decade or so, there's been a whole conversation about emotional quotient, EQ, this idea of how you communicate with others, relate to others, build teams and things like that. But this new research of one's adaptability quotient, one's ability to respond, not just in moments of difficulty, not just being resilient, but actually to respond to change. That is so fundamental to what we're all doing now more than ever in the world of COVID and working from home, parenting from home, homeschooling, all that. But just the reality of the life in the 21st century. Technology is changing at such a rapid rate, and also the way the workforce is evolving. This idea that the gig economy or part-time work, flexible work hours, remote working changes fundamentally how we have to think about our lives and jobs. And then add on it the fact that the next generation will change jobs, some say as much as 10 times, as many as 10 times before the age of 40, right? And that's a generational shift in how people need to think about their mindset and how they adapt again to the world around them. These are all the clear reasons why talking about it more than talking about what it takes to be a good adapter, being adaptable in your mindset and emotionally is so important. And so there's a couple ways to think about it. One is, again, this adaptable muscle, this practicing how we respond each and every day to, what our behavior looks like when we have to adapt. And those are some of the things we talked about just a moment ago. And Laura, I would love to hear from you as well, like how you practice that in your career, because I think we probably both have learned experiences. But it's also interesting to think about how we have to emotionally adapt, right? And what it takes to become someone whose emotions, even if you get teary or if you emotionally respond, get angry, get frustrated, that's okay. But you have to be able to manage it both at home and at work to be a, effective adapter. And it's, you look at also what people are hiring for. And there's, after interviewing executive search firms and headhunters and those that are literally recruiting for senior leaders across all industries. And this is a skill they're looking for actively. Right. They're measuring people's ability to emotionally and behaviorally adapt, because the world needs it at all levels. So
yeah, we're at such an interesting moment in time, and this sort of microcosm, you're sitting in the catbird seat, if you will, from the standpoint of looking at how children, in your case, the girls that are attending your school, are adapting to this very interesting world. If you sort of looking at the last, 6 months or so, what do you think this generation, like what is the impact that you think that all of this sort of forced adaptation, if you will, both parents and kids, and in your case, the girls at your school, what do you think this forced adaptation is going to look like as we look back on this generation potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what I hope will ultimately be a silver lining, if we can call it that, to what we're all going through, right? It's a difficult period. It will continue to be difficult for the number of months, right? I think we all should face that, admit it, because then adjust our expectations. But I do think our kids in particular are learning a skill set that will be their advantage if we nurture it in a certain way moving forward. And what do I mean by that? I think about our girls this spring, right? And how they adapted, how they leaned into this incredibly difficult, frankly, scary for many, because things were changing so rapidly. And I know that there was stress on the home front as well. And that sort of begets stress for our children too. And when I look at how our girls leaned into it in certain ways, I think it really will be something that later on, whether it's college or the real world, they'll be able to lean into that muscle memory again. What do I mean by that? Thinking about one way that we behaviorally and emotionally adapt effectively is, counting on others, right? It sounds, again, cliche, but this realization that you need to ask for what you need, and we need to help our girls practice that. And then you need to build a team around you to help you adapt, to help you pivot, to help you find the resources you need in the moments of change, of struggle, of difficulty, or just, newness. And to see how, we consciously at the school built in moments of that, whether it was through drop-ins with the nurses or or their coaches or the school athletic trainer, or times when they would do, drive-bys on each other's birthday and cheer from the window socially distanced, or postcards we sent them that they would then send back to girls in their class. These little moments that they began practicing how you lean on each other and how you ask for support from one another in concrete ways help reinforce behavioral norms that when they're older and they have to, in my instance, right, change careers entirely. Figure out, on a moment in the middle of the Pacific when my skipper said, maybe you shouldn't be, flying if you're getting airsick every time you fly. And when we're in combat, that's not the best place to be in. What else can you do? And he handed me a satellite phone and said, just think about it. And I picked up the phone and called, right? Phone a friend, right? Phone a family member. And, I remember actually at that moment calling my father and saying, I'm at a decision point, right? What does it look like to adapt? And that just started a year-long process of calling on other people, my team, my cabinet of advisors. I'm sure you have one too, Laura, right? Where you say, well, what does it look like? How do I navigate this change? We don't do it alone. We can't. And that in particular for women is something that I think we want to build in their bag of resources, their toolkit, as it were. And so that's just one example of this idea of adapting. We go back to the idea of learning lessons of failure too, right? Another something that we saw our girls and our teachers lean into this spring. Those moments when we're all trying new technology and it didn't go so well. I will fully admit, and my students and parents will laugh when they hopefully laugh, right? My first major Zoom, the first all school assembly I did that first day back after spring break was a horror, right? Nothing went right. And we were scrambling, new links, not enough people on the Zoom. How did it work? And, as a leader, it was a moment where I probably wasn't my best self, but we bounced back and figured it out. And a couple, 2 hours later, actually got the all school assembly off the ground. But it was a moment to realize, lesson learned, right? Practice your technology beforehand, everyone, or it's okay to try things new and not have it work out. Again, these just moments where we help our kids today practice and build muscle memory for the behavioral and emotional skills they'll need in any point in life, but in particular what the 21st century is going to look like, right? It's change, it's adapting, it's going to be so much of that for the next generation.
And sharing with them, which I think is what you're getting at, sharing with kids too, that this didn't go so well. Here's how I felt. Here's what we're going to do going forward, so that they see you having that setback or failure. I hate the word failure because I just think it's such a, because you learn from it. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? Is that you're learning from it. But anyway, you illustrate to them these setbacks. Here's how I felt. It was really crappy, but here's what I'm going to do going forward. So it's a great lesson.
Yeah. And again, and you're right. I mean, you should always challenge the notion of failure, because of course these moments aren't failure in any way. And yet they feel that way. So, I mean, it felt that way to me and it feels that way to our girls, and acknowledging that moment and then saying, all right, but it's not, and let's rationally recognize that and then move forward. I think it's also important to feed in, particularly for young women, these lessons that are on the home front too. And so for me, it's those moments when the baby that joined the family. I had my first last fall, and
congratulations.
Thank you. But part of the story is, well, how do we navigate that, right? How do we both balance that and the challenges it presents, and then sharing with young women that it's hard, right? And we need each other, and then we need to adapt, and we figure out where our I won't say the word balance because I don't think it is a balance, but how we navigate these moments. And I think that's equally important to the story of adapting, and particularly the story that we women as adults and young women who are growing up need to think about now in this new reality we're navigating for the next few months.
Yeah. One of the other topics I want to dig into that you've touched on a couple of times is this notion of feedback, of having mentors or people around you who can give you feedback, but then also knowing who to listen to. When I read your story and when your mentor, I wasn't sure where the story was going as I was reading it, right? So I was reading it and the mentor said, you don't have to do this. And I thought, it kind of took my breath away because I thought, wow, how is she going to respond to this? How do you know? How do you know who to listen to? What's your toolkit for determining, who really has your best interests at heart, or sort of how to get that feedback, knowing what's right for you? Because look, objectively, everybody has a vested interest, right? Has their own perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, right? But how do you know? How do you know who to listen to?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that's a hard one. And I will say that there's definitely been moments where I've listened to the wrong people, I would say, or sort of went the wrong direction. And yet I think this is where, trust your gut, right? I think there's a moment where we just have to say what feels right. And the reality that is so hard to believe, particularly when you're young, but when in hindsight, it usually works out, right? And so these moments when you think, is this really where the direction I should be going? And later you look back and, for me, exactly, it was the decision to stop flying for the Navy. It was a conscious decision to start doing something else for the military, which then, unfolded and sent me a very different direction. And I've had the good fortune of being able to now say in hindsight, even though for a number of years it felt like something, a challenge I was still trying to prove was okay. And now being able to serve in a whole new way and give back to a whole new community, and having both done that in the government and now at a school. But it was this moment where you're right to call out, oh, is that the best advice? I think the other thing to consider in that is, it's this idea that, it's this idea of the difference between sponsorship and mentorship. And this is something in particular I often coach professional women on, or sort of when I'm at the audience is a little older, but my upper school girls too, my seniors at Baldwin, we talk about this idea that, a mentor is someone who gives advice and perhaps will provide you info, but a sponsor, and that's something that women don't do as well, find sponsors. This idea that a sponsor is someone who puts themselves out for you, who seeks you out and finds opportunities for you, who brings you into the fold in moments when you might not otherwise be, which is a little bit of a different role than a mentor plays. Mm-hmm. I think more and more we have to think when we're evaluating advice, is it coming from someone who's been a mentor? Or is it coming from someone who has sponsored you? And that's a subtle difference, but so important, particularly for women who by and large do not as effectively nurture sponsors. And particularly in the corporate or business world, seek out sponsors who will help propel their careers. And I have the good fortune of, along the way, having a few sponsors because of the nature of my work in the Navy and at the White House and counterterrorism fields and national security, largely men, but those who looked out for me, right? Who pulled me into projects, who, some of the ones I ran out and grabbed, but some of the ones were those who said, this will be good for Marisa. Marisa can do this. This will be, and in particular, my skipper at the time was that, person who sought out opportunities for me. So I, it was a voice I trusted, but it's hard to know. I don't know. Laura, that's an interesting one. I'm curious if you have other, sort of personal lessons about the finding of the voice, but maybe we can talk about that after the.
Absolutely. So I was thinking too, about, as you develop mentors and sponsors, people that are part of your tribe that you develop in different roles, but that, as you grow in your career, and in your case, because you've had some really interesting career pivots and a very diversified background, if you had to develop a different tribe once you got to academia. And I found this, and I think it was somewhat surprising to me that sometimes you need different people around you, that the same people who have provided you advice, they still give really good advice, but sometimes you need different perspective, and you may have to branch out beyond your sort of existing network. So maybe talk a little bit about how you've evolved your tribe, if you will, for different roles that you've had because your career's been so diverse.
This is, again, this idea of it's a skill, right? I think we, taking a step back, we think often about these like big ideas that we need to nurture in ourselves. We need to be confident. We need to be resilient. We need to be bold, right? And that's overall what we want for ourselves and our girls, I would argue, right? And yet so much of it comes down to tactical skills, things you need to be able to do on a daily basis, like, to your point, networking, right? Building a tribe, building a kitchen cabinet, right? Like the joking way we say it, but this cabinet of people you can turn to in moments, personal and professional. And I think there's very conscious and discreet ways you can do so. One of the things we practice at my school with my girls in leadership seminars, we actually do a practice coffee meeting together, right? And I spend a whole day of the seminar, and we go through all the emails that I've sent to senior leaders and all the emails that I've received from people who are trying to seek information from me. And we critique them. We say, okay, a couple of years ago, some, youngster wrote me this. What do you think how did it go? What do you think worked? What do you think didn't? Here's an email that I sent to someone who's senior at the Pentagon when I was trying to find my next job, right? What worked, what didn't? And through the lens of a 16 or 17-year-old, you're like, wow, this is what you do. You actually cold email somebody or find a connection or nurture a contact. And I think it's a skill that we can teach our kids and our girls in particular, this idea of nurturing their voice, that they're self-advocates, that they need to go out and find somebody. And this is where you go back to who will potentially be a mentor and over time maybe turn into a sponsor. We actually then do this exercise where we have them act out a coffee meeting. We have them come with me to the faux Starbucks, which is the front of the classroom, and do a session where we talk about this idea of how do you nurture your tribe, right? And what kind of information, how do you then do the follow-up? And for me, that's sort of the starting point, of course, then, and I know that you've probably practiced this over time, it's growing that circle of people, keeping in touch with them, making sure that it is not just asking for advice, but offering input, offering support and help along the way. And that finding moments to check in with people who then know people, everyone. I have to say, when I started this job, so many folks reached out to me and said, I think there's someone you should talk with. Administrators at higher ed, administrators at other schools, people in the education sector who have a different perspective. And I think one of the strengths that women in particular can bring to when they change careers and they pivot is this idea of using lots of different perspectives, because of how we communicate and because of, frankly, being open to the different lenses that different sorts of the diverse perspectives bring. And so, I fundamentally connect with my senior leaders who I work with or collaborate with in the Pentagon or overseas in the government, because they have a great perspective of how you lead, frankly, in a moment of crisis. Right. So when we entered the pandemic, one of my first calls was actually to a girlfriend of mine who's a senior leader in the U.S. Army, right? And we talked through, how emergency preparedness for, not just the military, but for school. And we talked through, what am I going to do to, manage the crisis here? The same lessons about how you prepare a team in that environment. I jokingly tell my team that they have responded to this better than, a squadron would on the front lines of the Navy, but they're doing it. So I guess it's both this idea that we can always find new people in our tribe, but that sometimes actually relying on those who may seem outside of the tribe is as effective to, pushing our thinking. It's sort of the two together work.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Let's talk a little bit quickly about impact and the impact that you hope to have both in this role and with this new book.
So I think, impact can be so personal in many ways when we think about the impact we want to have on communities around us. And so, for me, it's in particular the impact on a community that gave me a lot, right? I went to Baldwin and as we said in the beginning, it sort of set me off on my path. I have the good fortune now of also seeing in the long term how the thinking and the the skills that we're teaching at Baldwin and that I talk about in this book have, not just a trickle down, but a ripple out effect, I'll say. And this hope that, if we can start talking to our young girls different, start having them practice certain skills, they will be able to thrive, lean into their natural strengths, and make them competitive advantages no matter where they head next. But also that these are lessons that we as women can take on too. And it's just the sorts of advice that I wish I'd had more of when I was in my 20s, and then I want to make sure today's professional women and today's future leaders, young women in my school, but beyond, get. And I think you'd agree, Laura, right? This is the future that we want to give to, the world, right? The community deserves it. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One final question.
Of course.
I ask everybody who comes on for a single piece of advice, a life hack or a mantra. If you could boil it down to one thing, recognizing that there is a ton of awesome advice in your book, what would be that one thing?
Yeah, I think it's never forget that the people are what matters the most, right? And if you lean into the people around you, that's where impact happens. That's where, the sort of the positive feedback that we all need to keep going, particularly now, it really happens. And I see that no more so than in my school these days, and really thinking about what our teachers are doing, what our faculty, staff, what our girls need, and that impact lies. So the people make the mission.
Beautiful. Marisa, thank you so much. I loved it.
Thank you for having me, Laura. It was a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to continue the conversation too.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Marisa as much as I did, and I hope you'll check out her terrific new book. Again, it's out today, and it's entitled What Girls Need to Know: How to Raise Bold, Courageous, and Resilient Women. Remember, you can follow She Said Podcast on our Instagram at She Said Podcast. And you can follow me at Laura Cox Kaplan, all one word. And if you're listening to the podcast, I would love it if you could take a little screenshot while you're listening and add it to your stories. Make sure and tag She Said Podcast and Laura Cox Kaplan, and we will share that with our viewers as well. I'm so grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. I hope you got a lot of benefit out of this conversation. And if you've enjoyed it, be sure to check out all of our other episodes. I have 113 episodes on the platform, and there's such amazing advice and perspective. Women who are sharing their stories, their knowledge, what they've learned, how they've recovered from failure, and so much more in an effort to pay it forward to help you, whatever your goals, dreams, and aspirations may be. So with that, I'll see you next week. Take care.